Nullification crisis, a political conflict between the federal government and the state of South Carolina, had started as a dispute between the two sides in regards to the tariffs set on imported goods. What started as a simple dispute went on to be, as some would say, the groundwork for the South's later defense of slavery and the federal government's defense of the Union. Now the question is posed, how did the nullification crisis play a role in the Civil War and ultimately affect the cause of the abolition of slavery? And while there were many incidents throughout time where it either had a positive or negative effect on the Civil War, the answer to that question in regards to the nullification crisis is not as straightforward as one may think it would be. This is because during the war, both the South and the federal government used their experience from this crisis to defend their position. Now, of course, to understand the effects of the nullification crisis, we must first understand what the crisis itself was, why did it occur, who did it affect, and what were the end results. We started in 1828 when everything was going normal for everyone. The North is continuing to become more industrial, the South are flourishing in their agriculture and cotton trade, and the government is set with their priorities of union all throughout. But suddenly, in the year of 1828, Congress passes a tariff on all imported goods from Europe. The Tariff Abomination. The southern states, especially South Carolina, were furious, because now they not only have to pay more for imported goods from Europe, but were also in risk of Europe not buying cotton from them. On the other hand, the North were quite happy about the tariffs because now it meant people in America were going to turn to them and buy more from their industries. And this was the reason why the South was really upset, because they made the claim that the tariffs were unfair and seemed to target them more and was more a favor for the North. In 1829, Andrew Jackson becomes president. The Southerners expected Andrew Jackson to side with them and call the tariffs off, but to their surprise, Andrew Jackson supported the tariffs. And since Andrew Jackson's ultimate goal for the country was the preservation of the Union, he passes a new tariff in 1832, lowering some of the rates of the tariffs. But this was not enough to satisfy the South, and they felt like they were still being targeted. Eventually, the South makes a big move and passes the Ordinance of Nullification.
So, John Calhoun, politician from South Carolina, came up with the idea of nullification. This nullification is pretty much that states could ignore or reject federal laws they did not agree with. So then in 1832, South Carolina passed a law saying they wouldn't follow the tariff and even threatened to secede from the Union if the government tried to enforce it upon them.
On the December of 1832, Andrew Jackson responded to the nullification, which was called Jackson's Nullification Proclamation. The photo you see on the screen is what was made back then using the proclamation where Jackson responded to the South. The song Yankee Doodle Doo was going around quite a lot back then, so they merged the letter and the song into one. In it summarizes Jackson seamlessly stating that no state has the right to disobey the federal law. And because the Union was such an important part of Jackson's mission and the US's in general, he threatened to use military force in order to enforce the tariffs, should the South decide to ignore the law or try to break away. This left the South with two choices, either accept the lowered rates of tariffs set by Jackson, or rebel and risk potentially starting a civil war.
However, with tensions at an all-time high and everything looking really terrible as if both sides are ready to fight, they actually instead agreed on a compromise tariff that lowered the tax over time. And with this, South Carolina backed down, yet they still made it clear that they would nullify the laws if they wanted to. In the end, the nullification crisis brought into perspective how tense things were between the North and South, and how far they might go just to defend their rights. This situation did not lead to violence or anything terrible due to the compromise tariffs, but I cannot say the same for the future, as North and South would then disagree on slavery later on and end up having a civil war between each other.
How did this conflict set the tone for future conflict between the North and the South and their views on the federal government? As we know, the South of the country opposed slavery and wanted it to stay that way as they benefited from it a lot. And as for the North, they eared more against it and did not want it in the country. and as for the government, lean more towards the beliefs of the North, and through this conflict of the South wanting the federal government to stay clear of them and not push their laws on them, even though this started because of tariffs, it set the foundation for the argument that the government should not force laws in the states regarding slavery. They would later use the argument that the government sided more with the North and are going against the South, which made the South even more inferior. So how can this tie into the abolition of slavery, and how did it affect the abolition of slavery? The main issue that South Carolina had with the government was the tariffs they had set and how it negatively affected the South Carolina's cotton business and their trade with Europe. And knowingly, those cotton that the South were getting were from farms that their slaves were working in. And so if the South were that upset that their trade with Europe was being negatively affected, they would most definitely be upset if the government tried to take away the one thing which brought them loads of cotton, which were the slaves. And so just like they argued that the government should stay away from what goes on in their business and shouldn't force laws on them, when the Civil War came around, they similarly told the government, you need to stay away from us and our slaves. And this time, with experience they already had from before, they basically fully separated from each other the Union and made their own group in order to keep their slavery laws. But the nullification crisis wasn't only in the benefit of the South during the Civil War. Because as we mentioned before, Abraham Lincoln really used Jackson's example in order to stay motivated and diligent in his fight to bring the country together and pose what right for all of the people. So we can say that in both helped the abolition of slavery as well as made a bit more challenging.